Hello guys, David Vose here again. Beautiful day. Sun's starting to pop out now. We still had some clouds this morning, but it looks like it's going to be sunny the rest of the day. Um, so that'll be nice. It's still really unusually warm. It did get cold last night, maybe a little colder, but it was still way warmer than it's supposed to be. Here we are, getting close to New Year's, and it's still warm. It's just very odd. Makes me sometimes wonder if we're not either tilting on the axis differently or the North Pole is drifting towards Russia, as they say, but that's magnetic pole. So I don't know how that would affect the weather, but it just seems like the North Pole slipping further and further towards Russia and Europe, so that it's actually colder in New England, America, Europe, and Russia, but it's been warmer on the other side. So further south on the western part of the United States, it seems like it's just been getting warmer and warmer over the last many years. And it's literally every year getting warmer and warmer and warmer here. But I don't hear that that's actually happening in Europe and parts of Siberia. It seems like it's getting colder. And that's exactly how they say that the magnetic pole is drifting in that direction. So perhaps we are slowly drifting, and the western part of the United States is going to literally be tropical in a few years. I don't know. Anyway, it's just a thought. But I hope you guys are having a wonderful day. So, yesterday I did a video and I mentioned something about 12 or 13, and I'll explain where I get this. Perhaps women of certain lineages that covenanted or had a ceremony in about the year 1840 something, 1842, to covenant to come back in another life and be together and produce a lineage or a priesthood or a destiny, a child of destiny, or some children of destiny, perhaps more than one, maybe 12 children or maybe more. Maybe there are 36 of them. This is another number that you see, and we'll get to this. And, I hadn't really planned on talking about this, although yesterday I had two different people saying they're anxious to hear what I'm talking about. So I guess I'm going to have to explain it. But in so doing, I need to say a couple of things. Some of you probably, if you've been watching, those of you who watch every video or most of the videos that I'm doing and are keeping up to date, have probably noticed some things. And one is that I have a unique lineage that I can trace literally back to Jesus Christ. And once you get to Jesus, you go all the way back to Adam, because of course we know that Jesus was of the lineage of King David, and King David was of the, all the way back to Adam. And that may seem to some of you as though I am trying to promote my lineage and say something about who I am. And I want you to know, and I'll be very honest, I would love for it to be true. I'm curious about my own self, my own lineage, as I'm sure all of you are. And I know that many people have speculated about who they might be in another life and this kind of thing. And of course, I've, seen this, and it's crossed my mind when I'm seeing all of this. And there's probably a whole lot more than I could put into this video today about things that have happened to me, very spiritual things, visions, dreams I've had, very strange things that accumulate over time and makes you think about things and make you go, One of which is the whole lineage, my own name going back to Peter Waldo and the lineage of the Capetian line, the Merovingian line, and all the way back to Jesus and Mary Magdalene. That's striking. The odd thing too, and I've spoken about it, is that my mother, and this is not any controversy. I mean, this is just real. I was born David Vose. My father's name is David Charles Vose. I'm David Andrew Vose. And recently I've had a sister that watches my videos give me basically, I think, a readout of possibly that Vose book that I mentioned some while back. I've mentioned it a few times that there was a book written on the Voses, my specific ancestry, back to Robert Vose, who came over to Boston. So I know beyond a doubt, and I've known this for many years, that the Voses go back to this area over there in France, on the southern part of France in the Languedoc. But, I didn't think anything of it years ago when I was younger, and my dad and my uncle had that book. And originally they had two of these books. I don't know where they came from. My Uncle Frank had one and my dad had one, but Uncle Frank's house burned in a fire, so my dad gave him his book. And I thought, darn, sure would have been nicer to give that to me. But anyway, that's gone, and I thought, never find it again. Maybe you could go look it up and get a rare book somewhere and order it. I have never done that. Probably expensive. But recently, a dear sister sent me something. It was written like a book, and I think it was from that book. And it literally blew my mind when I personally got to read it. What I found out was things, adding things to what probably my father and my uncle wouldn't be able to know, as I was able to then see things that they weren't seeing. The legend about my ancestry going back to this dragon and this woman that was riding a dragon over the sea, and I knew right away after I read it that was the same story as Arthur Pendragon, meaning my ancestry was from King Arthur of the Round Table. Now, I'm not going to go deep into all of this. I'm just briefly saying this is stuff that I've been aware of for some years, and it just keeps building. And then I ended up, of course, I when the Dan Brown's book came out, and I don't even think I ever read that book. I never had that book. But I saw enough of it and read bits and pieces of it online and stuff, and I got the general idea. But I really never really read that book until, well, I still haven't ever really sat down and read it. But I was doing all these videos and getting this information from my research and my and prayers and so forth, and wasn't aware of it at first, but it really matches, almost literally straight up matches the information that Dan Brown had. And then I found the connection between Sinclair, which is in Dan Brown's book, who came and discovered Nova Scotia, which was a lineal descent from this Mary Magdalene Jesus Christ lineage, the Merovingian line, is what Dan Brown says. I don't go too much into the Merovingian part. I prefer talking about the Capetian, which is, there are branches. I think the Merovingian line is certainly one line. But going further back, it's the Capetian line, and I follow it down through Peter Waldo, who owned 169 city, towns, and villages, along the Rhone, all the way to Paris, from Marseille, Lyons, Montpellier, and all of this up through. And, immediately when I learned this, I began realizing, wait a minute, if they owned all of these towns, they're royal. And then when I really began to understand what this royal thing is, what these Waldensians were that were persecuted because of who they were, and how they related to the Cathars and the Templars and the Knights of St. John. This is all that I've developed years later. And then to see that the Sinclairs were knowingly related of the same high bloodline as the Vaux line, or the Vos. And so you've got St. Bernard, Claire, Vaux, which synchronizes the Vox line with the Claire. And when you see Sinclair, it's just St. Clair. So it's the Claire line with the Vox line that seems to be two of the most prominent lines that went down through the Knights of St. John. And then I talked about the Con line that ended up in Ireland, and the kings of Ireland were McConnaughts that married the Joyces. And I found the Joyce name going back to the Julius, meaning joy, and all of these names that you keep naming kids, and all of these little synchronicities and things. There's so much more I could tell you. I'm just giving you a brief outline, and I'm not trying to promote any idea here. I'm only saying, if you want to know this information, I will tell you. I'm not trying to manipulate anything. I'm going to be as honest as I can possibly be, because I really want to know the truth. I don't want any hype. I don't want to pretend anything. I've never pretended anything. But, it is odd. I was named David. And then we get to this Joseph Smith thing, who married a Ruth Vose. And I had wondered for a long time, but didn't really know how I would be able to find out if Ruth Daggett Vose could have been my great-great-great-great-grandmother. I speculated, I could assume, I could wonder, but I didn't know. Well, over the last few weeks, I've been trying to determine if perhaps that was my grandmother. But remember, all of this is mingled with the fact that I do not believe that Joseph Smith had any more wives than one, which is Emma Smith. And therefore, if there's any validity to Ruth Vose and the other women that supposedly had made some ceremony or contract with Joseph Smith, it was not a marriage for this life, but it had to be something else. And it's really odd that I've done the research and I've proven and found that it was not marriage or polygamy, had nothing to do with polygamy. And we can prove that, and I'm going to show you that today. But it was a sealing for the next life. And that there's a whole bunch of stuff that they're covering up. One, that Joseph Smith never was a polygamist, but that Brigham Young, who was a Cochranite, which is a group that was from Maine that were polygamists, and they called it spiritual wifery, same word, something they coined, spiritual wifery, a guy named Jacob Cochran, and Brigham Young was a member of that and started collecting wives long before Joseph Smith ever even came up with this sealing thing, ceremony to seal for the next life, which is, we're going to show you what that actually was and what Joseph Smith believed it was. It's nothing to do with polygamy. So when Brigham Young was sent in by the Cochranites, which I now believe was a movement created by certain individuals that came from Britain, from the York Rite. That's why they called it New York and Maine and this area. They wanted to create, just like the good guys were coming over here to build the New Jerusalem and had good intentions and were lineal descendants of Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ. There was another group that knew about this. We talked about that. That's the Illuminati. They came over, infiltrated. We've done some really enlightening videos recently about this. Well, the group that they started when they first got here was Cochranites, and they were spiritual wifery and polygamy. It's very similar to John Dee and Edward Kelly, that as soon as they opened up the bottomless pit and the devil came out, he told them they got to swap wives. It's very similar to that. They were swapping wives and doing things, but it had nothing to do with sealing and ceremonies for eternity. It was just, it was just adultery and lewd behavior that they were trying to cleverly disguise as some scriptural thing, and it had nothing to do with Joseph Smith. And we can show proof, but I'm not going to have time to be able to do this all in this video. But there's gobs and gobs of evidence that Brigham Young said himself that it didn't come from Joseph Smith, that he's the one who introduced it and had this revelation. Well, he's not the one. He's lying. He's just a liar. He got it from James Cochran, and it was called the spiritual wifery. So this was done like in 1836, and before. Brigham Young came in, and about the same time that Brigham Young came over, there's a man named William Law that was also opposed to Joseph Smith, hated him, made a newspaper, the Nauvoo Expositor, I think it's called, in around this same time, to try to frame Joseph Smith. Now, whether William Law was in on it with Brigham Young is not sure. We're not sure if William Law was just a man who was a hater of Joseph Smith and was publishing false information, and then some other people went in there and burned that down. Well, they blamed Joseph Smith, but he didn't do it. So this is one of the reasons that Joseph Smith went to jail just before he was martyred. The reason Joseph Smith was martyred, basically, was people said he was a polygamist. Well, the reason they said that was because it was Brigham Young and a group of individuals that were coming in, and at the very same time, boom, Joseph Smith goes to jail. It seems like it was a plot by William Law, Hyde, and Orson, and all these guys that I don't even know all their names. They were all in cahoots with Brigham Young, and one of these individuals, I think it might have been Orson or Hyde or one of these guys that were actually whisked off to jail with Joseph Smith. And there's lots of evidence that that was the person that was a friend of Brigham Young that had the gun that killed Joseph Smith inside the jail. It was a inside murderous plot. We can't say, we don't have a document that says Brigham Young said to do it and told him to do it. But we know of their affiliations, and we know that these guys hated Joseph Smith. And we know that they blamed Joseph Smith for all of this, but it was all just, right, the Illuminati that were coming in and infiltrating. We've talked about how they killed Lincoln, they killed Joseph Smith. It was definitely a plot. Abraham Jonas was not a part of Albert Pike and the other side that reformed Masonry into 33 degrees and infiltrated. It was an Illuminati plot. We did a whole video on that a couple days ago. A couple days ago, I said that Abraham Jonas was Ashkenazi Jew. Well, they always tell you that. But I had forgotten to tell you that a lot of people think he was really just Sephardic Jewish, which is important because the Ashkenazi Jewish individuals, the one that started the Illuminati from Germany, the Sephardic Jews were the ones from Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ. They're Jewish through Jesus Christ, but they called themselves Sephardic from the Languedoc. Sephardic meaning the Sephardic kings, or the shepherd kings from Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. You can look that up, the Sephardic kings, or the Capetian line. So you see here, AI says Sephardic connection via marriage. Abraham Jonas and his brother Joseph both married daughters of Gershom Mendes Sexius, the first American-born rabbi and a leader of the prestigious Sephardic congregation, Shearith Israel in New York. And then, his first wife, Sexius, and his second wife was Louisa Bloch, who came from a prominent Jewish family in Virginia. And Virginia is the group of individuals that originally came here, part of the government, that would be the correct line from France. Brigham Young is the culprit, and a few of his individuals. We note that Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, Sidney Rigdon, Hiram Smith, Joseph Smith's brother, and of all these original apostles, there were 12. Never any of them ever went with Brigham Young. They never denied their testimony of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon and all their experiences. They were always loyal to Joseph Smith. Many of them stayed there and joined Emma Smith's and her son in the reorganized church later. They hated Brigham Young. Joseph Smith said Brigham Young's going to lead the church to hell. I think there was even an attempt by Hiram and Joseph Smith to disfellowship Brigham Young, excommunicate him. And, of course, the fact that Hiram and Joseph Smith were murdered, then Brigham Young just did whatever he wanted after he died, ripped out the the commandments in the Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price. Now, mind you, this is a forceful takeover of the church. Brigham Young made a forced takeover. All the apostles that were with Joseph Smith were either martyred, ran out of Nauvoo, burned down, persecuted, but they never went after Brigham Young. This was a legal forced takeover of the church by Brigham Young. And the Book of Mormon ripped any reference out to you shall only have one wife, which there were several places, chapters, revelations about this one wife, only one. They ripped it all out after Joseph Smith died, rewrote prophecies saying you should have more than one wife, stuck it in there. This is pretty blatant. Now, the only reason why scholars or historians say that, well, they think Joseph Smith really was a polygamist is because of this. One, you've got all these women that supposedly were wives of Joseph Smith that became wives of Brigham Young later and went to Salt Lake. Well, I don't believe most of those weren't Joseph Smith's wives. It was Brigham Young saying, I want many wives, and to make it look like it's okay, I'll say they used to be Joseph Smith's wives, and now he died, and now they can be remarried to me. And this makes it look like more legitimate. That's pretty much about 90% of what's going on there. But if you've got a group so vile, which are the Illuminati, which is what they are, they're going to lie, steal, cheat, do whatever they can, murder. They're not opposed to signing false affidavits if they're willing to murder, especially the prophet. And there were certain women that supposedly had signed affidavits saying that they used to be married to Joseph Smith. Stuff like this is why historians believe it was true. But the truth is these women were wanting to be wives of Brigham Young. They may have been influenced or intimidated. There's definitely, we know that Brigham Young was willing to murder. He burned down the Nauvoo temple and ruined Emma Smith's life there. You know, what kind of a person would create a group called the Danites that would go in and murder people? And then it wasn't long after that. Remember, that's not very far from Chicago. So once they were driven out and went to Salt Lake City, most of the Mormons, remember there were 70,000 people in Nauvoo, Illinois, who were all Mormons. And only about 15,000 of them or 17,000 of them ever eventually went to Salt Lake. So there was like 50,000 people there. Biggest city in the West was Nauvoo. And it was only maybe 50 miles from Chicago. So they ended up going to Chicago. And then a few years later, that burned down. Now, we know beyond a doubt that Brigham Young burned down Nauvoo and the temple there. And any other burnings like the temple in Kirtland, Ohio, and things like that were done not necessarily by Brigham, but by this group of Illuminati Masons that were affiliated with Albert Pike and all of this. They were trying to stamp out this prophet and what he was doing, and then infiltrate and take it over and claim he was a polygamist, but it never happened. The other thing is they're looking at the fact that Joseph Smith did say that there were certain sealings. This was a revelation he had that we should seal, and I'll read this here that AI will explain it to you here in a minute, which was not at all polygamy. It had nothing to do with polygamy. It had to do with ceremonies that you would come back in another life and raise up seed and bring about a destiny child and a priesthood. And we'll get into that. Trust me, there is so much proof beyond any shadow of a doubt. And I'll just say a couple more things. Joseph Smith, if he was a prophet, could not be a prophet if he was a polygamist. Number one, because polygamy is wrong. Number two, because Joseph Smith swore in a Bible with his hands on the Bible a couple of times, and then swore in affidavits and every other thing you could imagine, and in his own personal testimony many times, that he was not a polygamist, didn't believe in polygamy, hated polygamy, tried to excommunicate the people who were polygamists, and vehemently denied it and swore on a Bible that it was not of the Lord, and wrote many verses of scripture there in the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, denying and prohibiting polygamy and swearing it was not true. If you're going to lie and practice it, why do you need to write scripture that says don't ever do it and then try to excommunicate people that did try to do it? In other words, if he was going to lie about it, he'd just do it privately. He wouldn't have a revelation and write prophecy down, stating forevermore, with your hand on the Bible, swearing to the Almighty that you didn't do it and you didn't teach it. It's one thing if you got caught and you said, I didn't do it. But if years before you, or even was blamed for it, you specifically wrote many documents saying it was not true. And even when it was going on, you literally came out and said, this is wrong, and condemned the people that were doing it. And you ended up going to prison for it and kept claiming you were innocent. And then your wife said, no, there's never been any other wives. Never. Your children, you'd think his children would have saw some of these wives. There's never been any children that were related by DNA. There's never been 1 ounce of proof that Joseph Smith ever committed any kind of adultery or slept with any other woman other than Emma. Emma would have left him straight up if he'd have ever done that. And then there's some confusion about these two words, like spiritual wifery, polygamy on one side, or eternal marriages or something like this. And then the words that Joseph Smith used. Number 1, today Mormons talk about temples. Oh, we got to build temples. Do you know that Joseph Smith never once ever spoke about building a temple? He spoke about building the house of the Lord. He always used that term. So there's a lot of stuff that they're twisting. So Joseph did teach that we could seal individuals to each other for the next life to make arrangements for reincarnation. Here's another thing. Today, Mormons don't believe in reincarnation or transmigration, and they claim it's of the devil. And yet Joseph Smith taught, and I will show you here, he taught transmigration and reincarnation, and that you would have a mortal probation as many times as you needed until you achieved exaltation, meaning reincarnation and transmigration. So all of this is twisting of words and things that Joseph Smith said, changing this idea of sealing and ceremonies of sealing people to you, like children, families, lineages, and then this Arios Gamos thing, which was not a marriage in this life, but it was a ceremony to keep the priesthood going. If you were murdered in this life or martyred, then you could come back in the next life and you would be destined to inherit a body and meet up with the other person and continue the line. This is how Arios Gamos actually works. This is what I'm finding out, what the true Arios Gamos was. It was marriages that would be had in the next life. So let me just, and then one more thing before we go on. So Emma denied it, refused to believe in it, swore on a Bible herself, all her kids. Harrison, all the original apostles, denied polygamy, denied that Joseph Smith ever did it or said it. And there's just a lot of lies and garbage going on. But let me also say this. I am not doing this to try and promote who I am or try to tell you anything about me or what I'm doing, other than I just want you to know that I personally don't know. And I am just like any one of you wondering about who I am. And when I found this information, I just simply wanted to know. I'm just curious. And I am not going to just get half the information and claim something. I'm only going to give you the information we can absolutely establish, and that's all I'm going to say. And if it doesn't lead anywhere, I am not going to claim anything. I wouldn't claim anything anyway. I just want to know what's really going on. I want to know what Arios Gamos is. I want to know the whole story about Jesus and Mary Magdalene, what's really going on. I want to know if Joseph Smith was martyred. Listen, I had a literal vision in the field where the Lord told me that Joseph Smith was a prophet, and I couldn't believe it at the time. So I'm just as surprised about all of this as you. But I am only here today to tell you facts that I have found. If you want to listen, and if you're interested in these facts, then watch this video. And if any of the facts point to anything, I can't help that. I'm just telling you what it points to and what we do know. What we don't know, I'm going to also tell you. I'm going to tell you what we don't know. And I'm going to tell you what we do know. And that's all I can tell you today. And beyond that, we don't know. But I will just say, I do believe that there were ceremonies that were performed, and we're going to find out what they are today, and that they more than hint, they almost verify that this is what this ancient Arios Gamos was. This is something that was part of the original priesthood, and that it was performed by Joseph Smith and certain of these women that had they were not wives of Joseph Smith, but they were making a ceremony so that in another life, after this one, after he'd be martyred, that they could come back and have children of destiny to continue on this work, because they knew that the time of the end hadn't come, and that the devil was going to end up throwing some of them into prison and killing some of them at that time, because the time hadn't yet come, and they had to do this because it was part of the priesthood. It's almost like I'm saying, yeah, this really looks interesting, and it might implicate some of us, but that's just the facts, and I can't help that. And I know that a lot of people will think, well, you're just making stuff up. But see, that's not what we're doing. I'm only interested in the truth. So let me read this to you. It says, I wrote, excluding all thoughts, testimonies, and statements from all who were associated with Brigham Young, as he was not part of the true followers of Joseph Smith, and he hated Emma Smith, and he was from the Cochranites. Joseph Smith testified, hand on the Bible, he was not a polygamist and only believed in one wife. Emma testified this was all from Brigham Young, and Brigham himself said that he, Brigham, got the polygamy revelation and not Smith. All the women who were supposedly Smith's wives were taken to Salt Lake with Brigham and became his wives. I believe most were his wives all along, not Smith's wives, as Smith was in jail most of that time and was denying it all. They, William Law, in cahoots with Brigham and the Golden Circle Masons, infiltrated and murdered Smith. My question is specific. What was Smith's documented, I should say, declarations before he died, apart from lies told later by Brigham and his women, but do include anything Ruth Vose said and the two groups of sisters? There are two groups of sisters that Emma chose specifically for Joseph Smith, that they all came together and made a solemn agreement that in another life, these women would bring forth certain heirs, but we'll get to that. Also from Cowdery, Harris, Rigdon, Hiram, and especially what Joseph Smith said early on, up until his death, about sealings for the next life. I think he accepted reincarnation before he was martyred. Is there any intimation at all of these 12 or more women sealed to Joseph Smith, especially Ruth Vose, that it was a ceremony in this life to seal or bind them to marry in the next life, to produce a seed line priesthood? Is there also any correlation he spoke of connecting this ceremony to Egyptian rites or apostolic rites or Arios Gamos? And this is what AI says. Joseph Smith's documented teachings and the accounts of his contemporaries, excluding Brigham Young, his later explanations regarding sealings, eternal marriage, and ancient rites, reveal a complex system focused on binding families for the next life. Now, see, that sounds very like binding families. What do you mean? In other words, contracts for families to be done in the next life. a contract for the next life, and lineal restoration. Sealings and next life only concepts. In Nauvoo, Joseph Smith introduced a distinction between time and eternity only. Now, see, they're so bent on this idea that Joseph Smith believed in polygamy and time and eternity marriages that they use it in quotes. But did Joseph Smith himself ever use the term time and eternity? Well, if he did, it was only in conjunction with if you had a wife in this life, such as Joseph Smith did with Emma Smith. He married her for time, this life, and eternity. So that's the only connection that time and eternity has with Joseph Smith. The one wife, because we're only to have one wife for time and eternity. Period. Now, the eternity only means that in a mortal probation, if you were to come back as a mortal, not in eternity, in a mortal reincarnation, you would have a covenant to marry and bring forth a lineage. Now, that's something different. But there's nothing to do with polygamy here. Eternity only bindings. Several women, notably Ruth Vose Sayers, that's because Ruth Vose was married to a guy named Sayers, were documented as being sealed to Joseph for eternity only. Understand, not for this life, not as a polygamous marriage, but they were sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity. Now, that's their quote, but we're going to find out here as we go, it really wasn't about eternity, because Joseph Smith only had one eternal marriage, and that was with Emma Smith. But what we're really talking about is I really do believe that AI is trying to promote Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons and these groups, Jews, and you got to really put them into a corner to get them to admit certain things. They will continue to make statements that allude to things that people believe when there's no foundation for that belief. So here they're alluding to eternity as though there is one kind of marriage that's for eternity and another kind of marriage that's polygamous. There never was a polygamous marriage. The time and eternity is only for the one person that you were to be married with, monogamy, forever. So, her non-member husband, Edward Sayers, reportedly encouraged this, stating he only claimed her for this life and did not believe in a future state, while she wished to be bound to the prophet for the next. So, Ruth Vose, we know, wanted to be bound to the prophet Joseph Smith in the next life. Not for eternity, but just for the next life. Why? Only to, and we'll find out here in a minute, produce a seed, a child of destiny that would continue the priesthood. Because Joseph Smith knew that he was about to be martyred. He knew they were going to try to martyr him. And I'm sure the Holy Spirit told him this. The goal of seed and lineage, sealings were often framed as a way to raise up seed or secure a welding link that would unite the entire human family into a single eternal chain. Now, if you're going to unite the entire human family, that means that Adam is going to be sealed to all of his children. And this may be a complex thing that we don't fully understand. But I can tell you that it had to do with sealing people for eternity, in a sense that there would be Adam and Eve that would be sealed together for eternity, and only Eve and Adam would be married. After that, you would seal children and seal each of their unions so that their children would be bound to them as a family. And all of these separate families would all be bound and linked to Adam and Eve. This is what it's talking about. There is no hint of any polygamy there, either in time or for eternity. So, these were seen as essential for exaltation, which Joseph Smith taught was impossible for those who remain separately and singly in the next life. Now, you see, this is where, we've talked about soulmates, and I truly believe that everybody has their own soulmate. The problem is that you don't ever really find your soulmate and know who she is if you're not awake, and as long as we're in this mortal probation, we're not going to be awake. We don't have memory of past lives. We don't know who our soulmate is. And it could be that we meet up with our soulmate from time to time, and we know them, and they may be members of our family. We may have been married to them in the past. I don't know these details. But I know that we're not completely married and never separate again until the last life, and it is through a sacred ceremony, because at that point, maybe whether it's when you get to paradise and Adam and Eve can do the ceremony, or whether that priesthood was given to Joseph Smith, evidently, and he was able to do it in a limited way. We know that Elijah will have all the keys to the kingdom, restore all things before Christ comes. He will restore all things and turn the hearts of fathers back towards sons. So when John the Baptist returns, or Elijah, he's going to have the keys of the kingdom, which evidently David had the keys of the kingdom. Peter seems to have had the keys. So these are just, thoughts. But it does appear that before Christ returns, someone will have these keys and perform these sealings, perhaps, and then seal all of probably the 144,000 will all be sealed to their soulmates. So Plato said there are 72,000 males, 72,000 females. He got this from the Egyptian priesthood. We might assume that that's what's going to happen. When Elijah returns, who is John in our Bibles, and Joseph Smith said he may come with the name David this time. Now remember, Joseph Smith said that there was coming of his seed a man named David who would hold all the priesthood powers and keys. And this would be just before Christ would return. There would be a man named David. We find scriptures in the Bible about this man named David. You guys probably will note that my name is David, and we're talking about me possibly being an ancestor of this Ruth Vose. That's all I can tell you at this point. We're going to read it further and see if there's any evidence that I could possibly be some ancestor of Joseph Smith and Ruth. Now, I'm not going to tell you the conclusion of this yet. You'll have to wait till you get to the end. But I'm not going to hype it, and we're not going to exaggerate it, because I personally just would like to know if there's something going on and it involves me. I'd like to know. And by the way, guys, it involves other people, not just me. And maybe it doesn't involve me. We'll find out here in a minute. And by the way, it's taken me quite a while to get this information. If it hadn't been for AI, I would never have gotten any of this information. But I've spent days and days working on this to try and figure out how to get this information, see if there's any way to uncover this information. So it says Emma's involvement. Records indicate Emma was present for some of these ceremonies, including the sealing of Ruth Vose. Now think about this. Emma Vose was vehemently opposed to polygamy, denied it till the day she died, and hated Brigham Young and condemned the whole bunch that went to Salt Lake and claimed it was a big conspiracy, this whole polygamy thing. So why then would Emma be present for a ceremony including Ruth Vose and Joseph Smith? Unless it was something completely different than polygamy. It says she also famously chose two pairs of sisters, the Partridge sisters and Lawrence sisters, to be sealed, not married, but sealed. This is a different word. It has nothing to do with polygamy. Though she later retracted her consent as the physical implications of time and eternity became clearer to her. Now, there is another place where AI, because of the influence of the Mormons and this implication that the Mormons have made, that is not the same as the truth. So they say that she retracted her consent. That's not what happened. Emma Smith never retracted anything. She did it because she believed in it, because it was not plural marriage. It was not polygamy. It was not spiritual wifery. It was a sealing for something completely different. And Emma consented to that because it was holy and it was the truth. She never retracted it. What she did was later on, when people were accusing Joseph Smith of polygamy, she denied that it was polygamy because it was never polygamy. That's what you got to understand here. And this is confusing historians, but we're going to weed this out and we're going to figure this out as time goes on. And Joseph Smith and Ruth Vose and others, their names will be vindicated at some point, and hopefully by the end of today. Hyrum Smith initially opposed it. Hyrum eventually performed many of these sealings. Okay, see how they're doing that? He opposed what? Polygamy. He always opposed polygamy. But he eventually performed what? Plural marriages? No. Sealings. Totally different. Including the one for Ruth Vose in February of 1843. February of 1843, Ruth Vose was sealed to Joseph Smith, not for a plural marriage. Because Ruth Vose was married to a guy named Sayre to the day he died. And he testified, Hyrum did, testified that the sealing, not a plural marriage, the sealing power was intended to bind families across generations. Now, you see, obviously this has nothing to do with some adulterous affair. This has to do with binding families across generations, according to Hyrum. So AI is lying. Oliver Cowdery, he strongly objected to Joseph's early relationship with Fanny Alger in 1835. Well, I'm not going to have time to go in and debunk everything that's going on here, but you can find that this Fanny Alger supposed relationship had nothing to do with any plural marriage or Joseph Smith having an adulterous relationship with this. And this is just a big lie. I could go into that and probably take another hour to go through that whole thing. But this relationship that Joseph Smith had with Fanny Alger, where they claim in quotes that Oliver Cowdery said it was a filthy affair, it has nothing to do with a marital affair. But it was a filthy affair, meaning that the people that was accusing Joseph of it was filthy. That's what he was saying. It had nothing to do with Oliver Cowdery accusing Joseph Smith of an affair. Because you can use the word affair as a marital affair or an adulterous affair, or you can use it to mean the affair or the controversy. So he was saying it was a filthy controversy, but not filthy on Joseph Smith on their account, but filthy on account of Brigham Young's accusations. The whole affair, the whole controversy was filthy, dirty and nasty, but it had nothing to do with any polygamous affair that Joseph Smith had. Sidney Rigdon resisted the expansion of these principles into plural marriage. Yeah, he resisted it because so did Joseph Smith, because it wasn't something that they intended to do. These were the original apostles that just literally didn't believe in what Brigham Young was doing. And AI, along with the Mormons today, are blaspheming the whole spiritual priesthood and all the things that went on in those 1800s. So it says specifically when it involved his daughter Nancy. His subsequent fallout with Joseph was largely centered on his rejection of these secret Nauvoo practices. Well, again, the Sidney Rigdon thing, you're not being told the truth about that. And it would take hours and hours to go through all these controversies. But Sidney Rigdon did not have a fallout with Joseph Smith over some kind of an affair with his daughter. That's another lie. Connections to ancient rites and reincarnation. Arios Gamos and apostolic rites. While Joseph Smith did not use the specific term Arios Gamos, sacred marriage, he frequently spoke of restoring all things, and described temple ordinances as recovering lost apostolic and patriarchal rights. The endowment was specifically designed for participants to become kings and priests, or queens and priestesses in the afterlife. Do you hear this, guys? The endowment, which happened in Kirtland, Ohio, when that was about 1842, right after Joseph Smith was made the master mason, initiated by Abraham Jonas, who was a direct lineage and initiated in this lineage all the way back to Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene, came over to America with Benjamin Franklin and Abraham Jonas, and then they transferred it to Joseph Smith. That alone is phenomenal and something that the world's got to deal with. That the lineal descent of the Knights of St. John from Mary Magdalene was handed down to Joseph Smith in 1842. It happened on March 16th, just about on the date of the spring equinox, about 4 days before spring equinox. And that was in 1842. And then around February, there's a controversy because Emma said that she was present when Joseph Smith was sealed to Ruth Vose in February of 1843. So this is very odd that all this began right at the point when he became the master mason of Illinois and for the people that were going west to rebuild the New Jerusalem. But it didn't start with Emma or Ruth Vose. It started in 1836, April 3rd, which was the Passover, and that started this whole endowment thing, that men would be sealed and that they would then be sealed for the next life to have these princesses and kings be born in the next life. And this happened at the temple at Kirtland in 1836 on Passover. And from that point forward, there were about 25, I don't know the exact number, but somewhere over 20 people sealed to Joseph Smith. Not married, not no plural marriage, but they were sealed to Joseph Smith for the next life to become princesses and princes. And then from that point forward, they continued to seal these individuals. And we get then down to Emma Smith, May 28th, February 1843. And we get to 4 sisters that we were talking about. So that's another 5. So there probably was about 36 individuals, which is the number of deacons in the astrological wheel. But that's interesting. And so it was called the Apostolic and Patriarchal Rights. And it was designed for the participants to become kings and priests and queens or priestesses in the afterlife. Multiple mortal probations, reincarnation. In his final years, they make it sound like he finally admitted it in his final years. Come on, guys. All of these revelations happened in the final years. Right during the time he was writing these revelations that the Lord was giving him just before he was martyred. It wasn't some final revelation in the sense of it, just a realization that I guess maybe he believed in reincarnation. He speculated. He wasn't speculating. The Lord gave him this revelation about reincarnation, which the Mormons today conveniently forgot to tell you. But he called it, instead of calling it reincarnation, he explored a concept he called it multiple mortal probations. Secret teachings. Eliza R. Snow, which is a woman, and Presendia Huntington both stated that Joseph privately taught a form of transmigration of souls where spirits might experience multiple lives to achieve perfection. Now, again, they're manipulating the words. They're saying it was a private teaching, like it was nefarious. It was private only in the sense that it was explained privately to somebody, that Joseph Smith was basically interpreting things that he was saying and saying, yeah, that's what it means. Reincarnation, transmigration. That's what it is. Not a private, secret teaching. Then Egyptian influence. Joseph's study of the Book of Abraham and the Egyptian papyri heavily influenced his view of the patriarchal order. He sought to recreate a cosmic order where priesthood lineages were bound through sealings to ensure eternal dominion. So, I write, can you expand on multiple mortal probations and how this might link to sealings or raising up a priesthood? And they say, well, in the final years of his life in Nauvoo, as all the other revelations were, Joseph Smith's private teachings, and they weren't private, it's just that he privately interpreted as something that was the same thing that other people were talking about with reincarnation. He was using different words. He wasn't making some secret private teachings. And so he said some of his associates called it multiple mortal probations, a concept that suggests spirits undergo several mortal lives to achieve perfection and exaltation. This differed from public one life doctrine and directly linked to his unique system of priesthood sealings and the restoration of lineages. Now get this. This mortal lives that you go through, or reincarnation, was directly linked to the unique system of priesthood sealings and the restoration of lineages. The concept of multiple mortal probations, while Joseph Smith publicly denounced the transmigration of souls, again, that's a lie. He never denounced the transmigration of souls. They put that in parentheses, and that is a direct intent to lie to you, because he may have used the word transmigration of souls, quote unquote, at some point. That could have been a quote, but not if you include that he denounced it. There's no denouncing of the transmigration of souls, quote unquote, anywhere. They're just lying. So he called something a doctrine of the devil, something, in 1835. But what was it? Well, it was something that somebody had said, that they were a reincarnation of someone, and they claimed to be something. And Joseph Smith, you're not the reincarnation of this or that. And he said, that's a doctrine of the devil, that you're a reincarnation of this person. He didn't say reincarnation itself was a doctrine of the devil. And this is something that AI is going to be held, well, AI is a computer, but the people who are programming AI and lying to the world about this, and the Mormons themselves, will all be judged for what they're saying, these lies. So, apostolic testimony. Eliza R. Snow was a firm believer in multiple mortal probations and stated she received the principle directly from Joseph. In the King Foyle sermon that he did in 1844, he taught, quote, you have got to learn how to be gods yourselves by going from one small degree to another. Okay, what does that mean? From one degree to another, transmigration of the soul. So, proponents of the multiple mortal progression argue this implies multiple mortal stages are necessary to transverse from a small capacity to a greater one. Probationary states. Some early saints believed that if a soul did not finish their work of preparation in one life, they would have to do it hereafter in another probationary state. The connection between the MMP and the sealings was rooted in the idea of building universal eternal family chain, eternity-only sealings as next life, quote, unquote. Women like Ruth Vose Sayers' sealings were often for eternity only. Again, there is no quote that says that Ruth Vose sealing was for eternity only, quote, unquote. There is quotes for eternity only, but not in the context of Ruth Vose. This is lie. This supposed idea that a woman could be legally married to one man in this life while being bound to a high priesthood leader like Joseph for her next mortal probation or her final exaltation. So you know that Ruth Vose never had any relations with Joseph Smith sexually. They had a ceremony. What was the ceremony for? That in another life they would come back and have a marriage that was for that one life, that would produce a child of destiny. However, Joseph Smith was married for eternity to Emma Smith. Then we have the welding link. Sealings were described as creating a welding link between families. If spirits experienced multiple lives, these sealings ensured that no matter which probation a person was in, they were legally and spiritually tethered to a specific priesthood lineage. Raising up a priesthood. Joseph's focus on seed or offspring was not just biological but theological. Sealings were intended to ensure a continuation of the seeds forever, meaning that in the next life or future probations or reincarnations, the priesthood holder would have a guaranteed family and kingdom to govern. Correlation to ancient and apostolic rites. Priesthood lineage. Joseph believed certain spirits were noble and great before birth, as taught in the book of Abraham, and were essentially reincarnated from prior worlds or probations to hold high priesthood offices on this earth. The restoration of all things. This was included restoring what Joseph viewed as the patriarchal order of the ancients, where sealings functioned as a form of spiritual adoption or binding that transcended a single mortal existence. Notice again that these sealings were not polygamous marriages in this life. They were not even always marriages at all in the next life, but they were a form of spiritual adoption, meaning that you made a ceremony or agreed in this life to come back in another life and produce a seed. That's all this meant. And that you were then going to be eternally bound in that family, because everyone in the universe has to eventually become sealed to their soulmate, and then their mothers and fathers and their mothers and fathers, all the way to Adam and Eve, which is the restoration of all things. And what is also apparent here is that all of these women were all sealed to Joseph Smith. So would all of them then, in different lives or in one life, all be married to Joseph Smith in the next life? No. Because, see, this was probably them making a covenant, because they weren't being married for eternity. Joseph Smith was already going to be married to Emma Smith for eternity. But these other women were saying, okay, we want to be sealed to you. Why? So that in another life, the next life, we want to be your children. So when you and Emma are reborn in the next life, you're going to have children. And you're going to have these different heirs, and we want to be one of those heirs in one of these lives, a princess or a prince, so that then we can go forth and have somebody else be contracted to be our child, or something like that. Now, we're not quite sure, but something of this sort. There's nothing nefarious going on here. This has to do with the doctrine of reincarnation and the Arios Gamos, which is also what we talked about the other day with the restoration of all souls in reincarnation. That's what the restoration of all things was, an Egyptian teaching that was the restoration of souls, apostasis, that we talked about the other day in another video. That's a scriptural teaching in the New Testament. And then we can talk about apostolic authority. Some early interpretations suggest Joseph believed he and others were literally resurrected or returned spirits of ancient prophets like Elijah or John the Baptist, sent back to complete the work of the final dispensation. I wrote, how did the teaching relate to the coming of David in latter days, to have on his shoulders the priesthood keys? Joseph Smith's teachings on the Davidic servant were fundamentally linked to his late Nauvoo doctrines of priesthood restoration. See, so all of this was late. It was the final years where all of this revelation was given to him. And it was priesthood restoration, lineal seed, and the concept of multiple mortal probations, or reincarnation. He described a future figure, specifically a literal descendant of the ancient King David, but not David himself, who would hold the fullness of priesthood keys and the spirit of power of Elijah. Now, that's interesting, but that connects David that's to come to Elijah. That perhaps David, who's going to be named David, will actually be the Elijah, or will be John the Baptist or something. And notice that it says that it was not King David himself, but a future King David. Well, AI and Mormons will then jump on that and say, well, it couldn't be, they don't believe in reincarnation, so they think it's a different David. It's the same spiritual being, but a different life. So the David in the past will be the same David that returns. But in that life that King David had, because of the sins that he committed, he wasn't allowed to be exalted and given all of the keys of the priesthood. It wasn't time yet. His mortal probation hadn't ended yet. He was destined to return in the latter days. And then he would have the keys and the spirit and the power of Elijah. The latter-day David versus the ancient king. Joseph Smith made a sharp distinction between the ancient King David and the promised David of the last days. Well, again, he's just making a distinction between a person who lived 2,000, 3,000 years ago, actually, and the guy that's going to be in the future. Not that they're not the same being, just like John the Baptist was the same person that once was Elijah. But there are two different people. John the Baptist and Elijah lived two different lives in two different eras. And that's the same thing it's talking about. Smith taught that the original King David, while having received certain priesthood powers, forfeited his exaltation and the spirit and power of Elijah through his sin involving Uriah and Bathsheba. Well, look at the wording there. He forfeited his exaltation and the spirit and power of Elijah. Well, in that life, he wasn't able to attain it. That's why he had to come back in reincarnation, you see. So the new David, Joseph prophesied that in the last days, the throne and kingdom of David is to be taken from him, the original King David, and given to another by the name of David, raised up out of his lineage, who would also be the same person reincarnated. So then it says, the concept of reincarnation provided a framework for how priesthood keys and specific titles could be inherited or returned through successive mortal experiences. The return of ancient spirits. Private teachings suggested that they keep on with this implication that it was just all private and secret, and it wasn't. The private and secret stuff was going on by Brigham Young until they had to come out with it once they got to Salt Lake and they admitted that they were, sleeping around. But it was specific titles could be inherited or returned through successive mortal experiences. And that's what's going on with King David in reincarnation in another life. Return of ancient spirits. Private teaching suggested that noble and great spirits might experience multiple probations to ascend the ladder of exaltation. Some of Joseph's associates believed that specific messianic servants were actually the return of previous prophets or figures under new mortal identities to fulfill specific keys. Elias, a recurring figure. Joseph defined Elias as a title for a forerunner or one who restores all things. This allowed for a doctrine where multiple individuals, John the Baptist, Joseph Smith, and the future Davidic servant, could all embody the same spiritual role across different times or probations. In other words, they're the same being. This John the Baptist, now I don't know that they ever said it was Joseph Smith himself, but John the Baptist could be the same person as this future David. Priesthood keys and the rod and root of Jesse. Joseph Smith provided specific interpretations of Davidic prophecies in Doctrine and Covenants 113, which linked sealings to these coming figures. The rod and root. Joseph identified the rod and root mentioned in Isaiah 11 as servants who were descendants of both Jesse, the house of Judah, and the house of Joseph, Ephraim. Right to the keys. To this future Davidic servant rightly belongs the priesthood and the keys of the kingdom. Joseph's sealings and Nauvoo were intended to raise up a righteous lineage, a welding link that would produce the specific heir to the Davidic throne. The sealing correlation, by binding families to himself through sealings, especially eternity-only sealings. Yeah, so they got to throw that in because that's their term, eternity only. But Joseph sought to ensure that the priesthood lineage would be preserved through all the mortal probations until the final David arrived to take the keys upon his shoulder and gather Israel. So there you go, friends. That is all we've got time for today. There is more information about this that I want to talk to you about maybe in another video, but I'm just going to leave it there for today. You get the idea. And nobody knows who David is or the other people, but certainly Joseph Smith at Kirtland Temple in 1836 got these certain priesthood powers where Elijah returned and gave him these spiritual keys, and then he began to do these sealings, which was simply to bring forth princes and princesses that would be priesthoods in the next life. And he believed in reincarnation and transmigration, and he got all these revelations, and there you have it. So I think I'll go ahead and leave it there, and we'll bid you adieu. Hope you have a wonderful evening. May the Lord bless you. His grace and his peace will always be with everyone. He loves everyone, and we'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a good one.